Greetings, Manchester. You're in tune to the search engine, and this is the Law at the Core show. Big shout goes out to the one and only Tiny G, dancing DJ, keeping you tuned, drive time style. Okay, this evening, insightful show, information, knowledge, guidance from a law perspective. And as always, your views and opinions are wanted, needed, and much appreciated. And you can get in touch via text line 075 9964 2626. That's 075 9964 2626. But if there's anything in the topic this evening that touches you so much that you want to actually pick up the phone, you can give us a call also, 0161 222 5636, and you can have any questions that you have answered. Our guest on Law at the Core this evening is Becky Zwane. I hope I pronounced that well. Becky is a commercial property solicitor, but when we actually introduce Becky and speak to Becky, she'll go into more detail and tell us about her journey and why she went into that area of law. But she's also going to be speaking to us on a few other areas. We're going to be talking on gentrification. We're going to be talking about government schemes that are available for businesses and the impact of COVID on many commercial, public and private properties. But again, this is the Law at the Core. I'm not the lawyer on this. We do have our lawyers who will be here with us, with the knowledge and the information, and be able to answer your questions and put in legalistic terms the conversation that we're going to be having this evening. So let me first of all say good evening. We are expecting Kyle and Liam, but we have got Daniel here. So let me say good evening, and we've also got Becky. So good evening, Daniel.
Good evening, Anthony. How are you?
Can you hear me okay? Hold on. Sorry. Hiya. Can you hear me okay? Is that better?
Yeah, loud and clear. Can you hear me?
Yeah, that's great. And also Becky is there. Good evening, Becky.
Evening. Hello.
Thank you very much for agreeing to join us and sharing your knowledge with us this evening. Daniel told us some great things about you, so
she paid me well. So
by Carl is doing this, so just Liam to go. But just the introduction. So I've said briefly, just that we are going to be talking to Becky. Becky is a commercial property solicitor, but I know her skills and remit are much wider than that. I don't know whether you want to give us an introduction to Becky. Asking Becky about her journey and then the other areas that we want to discuss for this evening.
Sorry, can I just interject quickly? Sorry, Anthony, I meant to let you know yesterday. So Liam's actually unable to host this evening, but he assures us he will be dialing in as a guest if he gets the chance. He's really up against it with recent projects at work.
Okay, no problem. All right, let's get going. Let's say hello and good evening to Becky. So anyway, no, we're not going to say it like that. We're going to get Daniel to give us an introduction to Becky.
Fine. Where do I start? No. So Becky is my colleague at Evershed Sutherland, which is a commercial law firm in all over the country, but we are both based in the Manchester office. I think I first met Becky a year, 2 years ago, and that was through the Black Solicitors Network. She's recently come on board as a committee member. I don't want to steal her thunder too much, but she's a commercial real estate lawyer, also with a bit of banking litigation experience more recently. And I'll hand over to you.
Hiya.
Oh, hello. Hi. Sorry about that. I was just chuckling away because the first time that I met Dan was a rather interesting experience. I'm really glad he did he didn't bring that up because I think that's just going to follow me till the day that I die. But as Dan said, we are colleagues and we work together for the same firm. And I am a commercial solicitor, acting primarily for occupier tenants, corporate occupier tenants, and some landlords as well with massive estates. So I do a little bit on the estate management side. I'm also currently a secondee to a banking litigation department, which is very, very different to what I qualified into and very, very interesting. I'm guessing you want me to talk about my journey into law, Anthony, at this point, because I'm not a very interesting person.
Well, listen, I've been having to do my homework on some of the words that Daniel gave me to talk about some of the areas that you do. So you are involved in. So it is interesting, you know, even for me, because these guys, they know I'm a lay person. I keep asking, please explain, please break down, or whatever. But I do find it very interesting, and I believe this is a really interesting area. And for many of us that are not into, I'm not saying it's all legalese, it might be just, you know, just concentrated on that area. I think a lot of people this evening are going to be surprised at the conversation we have and how much of what you're saying they does actually relate to things that are happening for them, and in a lot of ways realize that we should be having more conversations about these particular areas of gentrification, insolvency, and how these things work, having an understanding of it. So I'm actually looking forward to that conversation. But yeah, let's go back to your Joan. Where do you actually hail from?
I am Zimbabwean.
Okay,
yeah, so I've got a very, very interesting name, which most people tend to most people can't pronounce. And I moved to the UK when I was 14 with dreams of becoming a politician. That didn't really work out very well. I like that.
Pronounce your surname. I said Zwane.
It's actually Zwane.
Zwane. That sounds even better.
Yeah, my full name is Ndobego Nokolo Zwane, but about 20,000 people can pronounce that. So I don't think it's particularly interesting. So I wanted to be a politician, but I like the tact and the softly approach, let's say, that it takes you a politician. So I decided to become a lawyer instead. I did study politics at university, at City University, and then I did a GDL. So for all your listeners out there who probably don't come from a traditional background of going into university and doing law, there are other options out there. You can do a non-legal degree or non-law degree and then subsequently qualify into law via the GDL. And that's essentially what I did. So I did the GDL and then I did the LPC, which is what takes you to becoming a solicitor. Got my first job as a paralegal at Eversheds, went off and did my training contract with a smaller firm in Kent, and then qualified into real estate at Eversheds in Manchester because it's what I enjoyed as a trainee, and I'd had 2 years prior experience as a paralegal within commercial property.
And was it when you decided, okay, law is my way, was it that the area that you're in now that struck you first interest?
I'm going to be very honest with you. It wasn't. I don't think the area of law was sort of a particular driving force. More for me, what drove me was how much money lawyers can make. And so the decision to become a lawyer was purely based on financial reasons. As my mother likes to say, money can't buy you happiness, but it can buy you the misery you prefer. And as we're in lockdown, it's definitely buying the misery. So that was sort of the driving force behind actually becoming a lawyer. And I'm lucky enough to have qualified into an area, or to have become a paralegal in an area that I actually found interesting, and to have had the opportunity to qualify into an area that I still do find interesting, I still do find enjoyable, and I'm actually doing the job that I enjoy and that pays me reasonably well.
Excellent. Well done.
Not to say it reasonably.
Well, sometimes I mention finance and things with these guys on here, and they just smile, and that says a lot, I think. So I don't think many of these with the knowledge that you have, what you're doing, and well deserved. It's not easy work. You know, I mean, Daniel has talked about some of the times the papers and whatever in his role, sometimes that they have to go through. So it takes, it's, you know, it's you get paid for what you do, and it must be worth it. So
yeah.
we're gonna, just before we go to a break, some of the areas. Let me just remind you some of the areas that we're going to discuss when we come back. So one of the top headings was law and trends related to gentrification in inner city areas. So I think we're going to be starting with that one when we come back from the break. Is that correct, Daniel?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
Okay. So let's take a break, and then listeners will be right back with the Law at the Core show, and we'll be talking to Becky, with Daniel, and the MC in a bit.
Feel the vibe on Legacy.
Okay, that's like just 2 minutes there for this advert. So where did you actually study, Becky?
City University in London.
And I know this law thing is a long it's about 7 years.
Well, it depends on how you do it. So if you go down the traditional route, it's 3 years of university, a year on the LPC or BPTC, depending which avenue you take, and then 2 years training contract. So it can be, it's essentially 6 years, and then if you do the GDL, that adds an additional year to it. But that's probably changing because the Law Society is introducing a new super exam, not really au fait with the technicalities of it, but I know that it's going to be getting rid of the traditional trainee route and introducing one exam that students just sit and then they're automatically qualified after they've set that exam.
Excellent. And did you come across the Black Solicitors Network before you became a solicitor, or wow?
It was actually while I was a solicitor, so I was looking around. So I moved from, I'm a bit of a nomad. I don't tend to stick in one place for a very long time. But so I studied in London, spent 2 years as a paralegal in Birmingham, did my LPC in Birmingham, trained in Kent, and I'm now working in Manchester, having moved from Zimbabwe to East Sussex.
Are you on the run, Becky?
Well done, yeah.
Is that your name, Becky?
You asking questions, I'd have to kill you if I actually gave you the honest answers.
Why are you sweating?
It's the lighting.
I'm joking.
I didn't think you could see it. It's the glister. I'm glistening. It's the makeup.
On BSM once you got to Manchester.
Yes, I joined BSN. Yeah, once I got to Manchester, I sort of went to one of their events, and I think I actually spoke to Kyle first, who was very engaging and very charming. I thought, oh my god, they sound very like amazing black lawyers. Let me be part of them so I can join this amazing bunch of people, and hopefully their amazingness can sort of rub off onto me, and I can contract it by osmosis.
Okay.
Don't hold it against me, Becky. Sorry.
There's a chapter dedicated to how I was swindled by a black lawyer in my autobiography. I'm not saying it's you, but it well could be you.
Okay, that's another topic there. Then, if you just mentioned autobiography, I know you're a woman, and I'm not going to ask your age, but still. But welcome. But you don't look old enough to be writing an autobiography yet, unless you do the series. Welcome back, and you are in tune to the Search Engine. This is the Law at the Core show, and you're listening to Anthony. We are here with our co-hosts Kyle and Daniel this evening. Liam's not with us at the moment, or maybe later, but maybe next week. But the next time he is going to be with us, I think he may have some good news for us, but we'll let you in. So that's at that time. And we're here talking with Becky and Zwane. Is that right?
Zwane.
You know what I'm like, listeners. Zwane. And we're talking to Becky. Again, I did say she was here's me going through my notes again, a commercial property solicitor. At the moment now, we're going to talk, still within that area, but we're going to start with the discussion and It's going to be led mainly by Kyle and Daniel, although you know me, I can't keep my mouth shut, so I will be chipping in. And we're going to be talking about, I just seen it before I put it down. There it is. The law and trends relating to gentrification in inner city areas. And this, like I said, would be quite, not on this one, surprised how close it is to the house, because you don't have to go very far from this station to see signs of gentrification that has taken place. And also, I know for myself, growing up just in Hume and then being moved further out, I wouldn't have known the term then as gentrification. I think it was terms like urban renewal and things like that were being used. And as we know, things change a lot. So yeah, I'll hand over to you. Where do you want to start? What's the first question that you have? You wait too long, you know, I'll just ask questions.
Yeah, I could lead. Sorry, were you gonna go, Kyle? Or?
No, I think for me, I was just going to make a statement rather than a question. Is just to say that I think the term gentrification has become quite toxified, actually. But I think that to some people, gentrification, if we're calling it that, is probably the worst thing that can ever happen to a community. People feel that outsiders come in with very different cultures and expectations, and the issue that can happen is it pushes up prices for local people. That's usually seen as the downside of gentrification, but at the same time, you can see, and as you say, Anthony, if you look around the city, just how much money and investments and improvements are taking place, that I think gentrification can actually have quite positive effects on a community. I think it's just about how it's managed. So just a short bit of my theory there, but over to Becky.
I think that's a really good point, Kyle, and I think it'll lead very much into the conversation when Becky starts speaking as well.
Yeah. I think what I do have to say is that I do agree with Kyle that I think when we think about gentrification and we start talking about gentrification, we think about it almost overwhelmingly in negative terms. And I think that also always depends on who you're speaking to and essentially where they're from or where they come from on the social strata. So for people who are a little bit on the well-off side of things or who have money, gentrification is not necessarily a bad thing. But for people who feel displaced by gentrification, so people on the lower social end of the economic spectrum, is absolutely terrible because of the detrimental impact it has. So just to begin with, what tends to happen when an area is gentrified is that it's either through large-scale development, so a developer comes, buys a piece of land and erects, I'm thinking about inner city places like Manchester and London, a massive block of flats. And what you always tend to get is people talking about derogatively about hipsters with beards and cheese shops and artisanal bakeries moving into the area, Shoreditch, Hackney type places. That is sort of like the first wave of gentrification. And what tends to happen is that in those situations, the people that have lived in these areas for a very long time, who've built communities and communities and links with that local area, tend to get displaced because they can't afford to live there in terms of buying the properties, because new businesses and people are moving in, which is driving up property values in terms of buying and in terms of renting. So they then have to look elsewhere and move further out from their local area. And that disturbs relationships that they have with their neighbors, with the local community, and they see it as a bit of a disintegration. So it has got those negative elements for locals, but it also has some positive elements to it, because in areas where they're becoming gentrified, there is a sort of reduction in crime to an extent. Property values do go up in a way that actually benefits residents who actually own properties in that area, so they can then sell their properties and make a sort of a nice profit and move to bigger properties or move further out where their money gets them a little bit more for their the way they get more bang for buck. I don't know what the sort of colloquialism is. English is not my first language. Where they get more value for their money, sort of thing. And you get new businesses coming into the area, you get new opportunities coming to the areas for younger people as well. So there are positive elements to it, and there are negative elements to it. But I do tend to find, and I do agree with Carl, that the dialogue and the discourse around gentrification has almost overwhelmingly been so negative that it's become a toxic thing. That always almost pits people as the haves are coming in, they're taking over, and the have-nots have no recourse. They have nothing that they can do, which I think, in my view, is entirely is not true, because there are options out there for what sort of local residents can do if they have issues with gentrification, and it's something that's sort of recognized in terms of sort of local planning law, etc. So there are options for people.
Yeah, I was just going to actually say that to you when Carl mentioned this, that you said about the dialogue and this discourse. I actually wrote something here which with a big question mark. Is there anything such a thing as a natural gentrification? But sometimes this is where the discord probably would come, in the sense where there's no dialogue. People are more surprised about the changes that are going to be taking place in their area rather than being involved in the changes. And is that something that whether it's governments or councils have an obligation to do?
I think on the one hand, that if I was living in a particular area and I've lived there all my life, there's comfort in the familiar. And when somebody buys property and decides to do something to that, thinking about how I would feel in that situation, I probably feel powerless. But that's actually not sort of true. People in this country have a lot of power through the planning system. So if people sort of get together and they organize at a grassroots level and they engage with the consultation process, with the planning consultation process, there's a lot that can be done where they can have their voices felt and their impact felt. What tends to happen is that people don't necessarily engage with that process. They just assume, oh, it's happening and it's going to happen anyway, and then just leave it at that. And then the planning consultation process goes through, no one really raises any objections, and then they complain after the event. I'm pretty sure. Oh, sorry. I felt like Dan, you wanted to say something.
Yeah. Sorry to interject, but so I hear what you're saying regarding people do have the power to engage with these processes. I think we've all seen the video that went viral of the hand forth, Jackie Weaver, yeah. And it strikes me that local council is probably typical of a lot of local councils up and down the country. I mean, I appreciate it's in East Cheshire and a local council in Hume may look different. But outside of the formal framework of like local government, is there any scope for local people to influence planning decisions, or would they need to be part of some sort of local government association? Would they need to be like parish councillors? Would they need to be local councillors? Because I guess the question is, practically speaking, how many of the people who are negatively affected by gentrification are going to be local councillors?
It's not like you'll be surprised by how much disruption one person can make to a planning application simply by raising an objection, and the curse that a developer can incur trying to deal with that. So I think the problem is in this country, obviously there's always room for improvement, and there are ways in which individuals can be empowered more. But the local planning process as it exists now does empower individuals. I think the problem is people aren't taking advantage of the facilities, of the methods that they already have in existence that can sort of protect them. There are some developments, again, I think the ones that sort of spring to mind are the one that sort of what's happened in London, for example. So you've had the Haringey development vehicle that has almost ground to a halt because of objections raised by the local residents, because they came together and they talked amongst themselves about the issues that were going to impact them as a community, and they raised objections, and they then entered into dialogue with the developer as to what could and couldn't be done and how they could sort of work hand in hand with the developer to develop the environment in the way that sort of is beneficial for both parties, because the developer doesn't really, going into an environment, they will look at an economic opportunity, and up until the local population and the local society essentially tells them what their concerns are, they're not going to be aware of them. So it is up to people within those local authorities to sort of exercise a little bit of the power that they have and actually engage proactively with these developers. Because if I'm a developer and I'm trying to build somewhere, until somebody tells me it's a problem, all I'm going to be looking at is my bottom line. That is not necessarily a bad thing, because they are creating opportunities within those environments. They are rejuvenating and sort of creating an economy and getting money into some, or rather sometimes under sort of funded areas, and they see it as doing a good thing, and they necessarily won't be aware or won't be appreciative of the other more minute elements that may concern people. So for somebody who's living in the local area, it may not even be about money or crime or anything like that. It may be the fact that I've got, a community that I've grown up with that has embraced me since I was 2 or 3, and I know everybody on the street sort of thing, and I don't want to lose that. And so just engaging with the process, and that's what I think people at a grassroots level need to do. They need to engage with the process. They need to engage with planning consultations. And the information is out there, and it is available on government websites, on local authority websites. You can go online and you can find a planning permission from 1976 in some instances. So it's engaging with the process.
And this is a question that I guess might not be able to be answered generically, and it will vary from case to case. But if you have a hypothetical situation where, say, Apple or Facebook or Nike wanted to build some offices in a really flashy glass building slap bang in the middle of Hume or Stretford or Moston, and a handful of locals who have lived there for X amount of generations were opposed to that development on the grounds that it has the potential to drastically change their local community. It will increase prices, not just house prices, but also the price of shopping when the local shop turns into a Waitrose, when the bearded hipsters come in with their Starbucks. They raise all those objections, and they're in effect raising those objections to, I presume it would be Manchester City Council, who stands to make maybe millions of pounds in extra revenue from this Facebook, from this Nike, from this Google. What are their chances? And again, this may differ from circumstance to circumstance. There might not be a generic answer, but I guess what I'm asking is, how sympathetic are councils to the arguments of locals when the council stands to make potentially millions of pounds in extra revenue from these businesses and developers who are gentrifying these areas?
Well, obviously, councils are not going to stop local areas developing and regenerating simply because somebody is upset that Google's going to build a glass window that's going to annoy their little parakeet or whatever animal people have in their garden, because ultimately the needs of the many have to outweigh the needs of the few. But in such situations, obviously, well aware that we're speaking in hypotheticals, the last thing big corporations want, or a big developer wants, is to be on the front of the Daily Mail website with a little old lady and a Zimmer frame saying they are trying to chuck me out. So people have a lot more power than they think. It's not just in terms of legal avenues, it's also in terms of utilizing things like social media, actually. And all of these things are always a discussion. It's never a case of a developer will come in and just move anybody out, or it does not work like that. There are avenues and there are ways of engaging with the process via sort of the available legal routes out of the planning process. And in those situations as well, you will find that those corporations who do go into the environments will have spoken to the locals to an extent, and they will have considered the impact of the feasibility studies. There's a lot of things that goes on before a building can actually be built. So there's a lot of things that go behind the scenes, and sometimes you find that locals are actually compensated for that. So it's not, no one is ever going to be told it's Monday, I'm building, pack your things and move. It's the process. And I think the key thing to take away from this is that local local communities do have an element of power. It's not something that is not sort of outside of their control, that it's going to happen and they have no say in it. They can actually proactively engage with developers, with the local authority, to develop their communities, because I think we all want to see our communities develop. We all want to see better opportunities coming into our local authorities, because one of the things that we have as a big problem in the north is the brain drain to London. And that's because it seems as if London is where all the development is happening. So in instances where developers are coming up north, and they are developing up north, and we need to engage as local communities with that process so that we also get something from it, and we just don't feel as if this is something that's happening to us rather than that we actually proactively involved in. Excuse me.
Do you need a glass of water?
Well,
listen, I've got a question here, still on that topic. It's given 267 says, what obligation do planning departments have to let communities know about developments, and how should this be done?
It's usually posted. I'm not a planning lawyer, so I probably won't be able to tell that it's in this publication on this day. But I'm aware that on some of the developments that I've worked on, it has been advertised either on the local authority website or on whatever council circular they have that sort of goes out. So you can go on your local authority website. So for example, I live in Lancashire, my local authority is Bolton. I can go online and I can find out what developments are proposed in our local area.
Okay.
So
is it down then to the individual? Maybe they might see a tractor drive through the town and they might think, hey, and then go online and but because I'm thinking, yeah, like you say, there's a lot of people know if the community has been a community and people are close to each other. I mean, would they have an obligation, like a local councillor, to come on like this radio station that covers a ratio? Would that be a good plus on their application form in the sense of consultation?
It is. I'm not sort of 100% au fait with the exact ins and outs of advertising, but I do know that it is advertised. The wheres and wherefores and the actual parameters of how it's advertised, I'm not 100% familiar with it, but I can definitely look into it and get back to you and say this is what the parameters, this is what the councils have to do. But equally, what I would say, and I know it sounds like I'm pushing the responsibility onto the local residents, but if it is your community and you're concerned about your community and you don't want them to be into your community without your consent, without your involvement, then get involved. Be proactive, show ownership, because you can't say it's your community on the one hand and you're not engaged, you're not involved in the things that impact and affect that community. Find out from your local councillors, hold them to account, because if you don't hold them to account, they will do these things. They will do what they think is best for that community because they're looking at things from a sort of a bird's eye level and a bird's eye view. And if you're not engaged with the process, then how can you then claim real ownership of a community if you have no interest as to what's happening to it? So they will advertise. I know that there will be obligations to advertise and let the community know, but equally it's up to the community to hold the elected representatives to account and actually find out what is happening. The information is out there. It is online. You can, like I said, I live in Lancashire and Bolton's local authority. If I go online, I can find out this information, and it's out there. Because what happens if you say they have to advertise in the Daily Mail and some people don't read the Daily Mail and they miss that? It just gets a little bit complicated and it creates a lot of obligation. The local authorities are already cash strapped anyway, when the information is freely available online and all we have to do is look.
Yeah, it is a difficult one, but it all, like you say, it does come down to that central organising, isn't it? People coming together.
Yeah, and it always takes one person. And we always laugh and say, ha ha ha, somebody's such a busybody. Sometimes those busybody jobs work who go around poking in everybody's business and saying, oh my God, have you seen that structure that's coming up? I'm very offended. It's steel and glass. Doesn't work. It's those people that sometimes we always look at and roll our eyes and just think, oh God, there's that nosy neighbor. Those are the people who sort of hold the communities together. and sometimes hold the corporations and councillors to account. So sometimes if you are that person, it's not always a bad thing. And those people who are going to be affected by this and are going to be impacted by this, you need to be more involved and more engaged with what's happening to your local community, especially now as obviously we've been in lockdown, and some people have been shielding, some people haven't been shielding, people haven't been able to go out, for example, particularly in light of the first lockdown, to get groceries. If you weren't particularly engaged in the local community, you probably would have been in a situation where you had no one to bring you groceries if needed be, and no one to contact if needed be, if you weren't particularly engaged with your neighbours and with your local community. So we have to engage, we have to connect with each other on a human basis, and only then can you be part of the change and part of the conversation. You can't wake up in the morning and say something has happened to me as if you didn't know.
Is there anything from a legal standpoint that can be drawn from what's happening in Hansforth to kind of show what the power of people, I suppose? And maybe Daniel, I don't know, you mentioned it before.
Yeah, I think that goes to what Becky's saying, really. I mean, most normal people will look at that video and be like, what a sad bunch of people. They all need to get out a bit more. They all need to get a life. What are they doing? But those people will probably have a lot more influence over what happens in their community as a result of their direct engagement. So as Becky says, it is often the person who's a bit obsessive, like trying to get the neighborhood together to do X, to do Y, to do Z. I mean, that person is often seen as the busybody who needs to get a life, but I mean, it can have a huge impact. And local government is a great way to take a bit more power and control over your life and what happens in your local community. I think personally, I'd probably like to also see a bit more of a responsibility on the developers. Like Becky, I'm not a planning lawyer, so I don't know exactly what the advertisement and publication regulations are, but I would certainly want to see developers maybe under some sort of obligation to literally post something through the letterbox of the houses of every residence, every tenancy that is within a certain radius of their development. If they do have publication obligations, I think posting it on a website is good. I think putting something through a letterbox would be better. I don't know if that's already an obligation, but just going back to your question, Anthony, I think, yeah, there's two sides to it. I think we'd probably always like to see developers do more to make sure people are aware and are able to have a chance to object or have a chance to consent. But the flip side of that is we don't live in an ideal world. So it comes down to the individuals also having to, take that responsibility to know what's going on in their community, and whether it's together or even as a bit of a lone wolf to try and influence what's going on.
And I suppose in some way, sorry, Becky, go ahead.
I was going to say, just picking up the point that Dan's just made about the post box. I know, for example, it sounds like I'm tooting my local authorities horn a little bit, but for example, we have a neighbour where I live. The neighbour to our left, the neighbour across the road, are actually doing some development works. We've had letters from the council come through to say that X, Y, and Z have applied for planning permission, and this is what they want to do, and this is how you can object. Whether or not this is an obligation across all councils, I couldn't possibly say, but I do know that councils do send out information about developments in the local area that are going to be impacting you, going to be affecting you. Whether or not it would go so far as saying a flat is being built a kilometre away from where you live and it may have this impact, not 100% sure, but definitely within your vicinity, you are informed. So something does come through a letterbox.
Okie doke. Thank you. Do you want to say anything else on that, Kyle? Do you feel we're not being sympathetic enough to corporate business?
I'm no voice for corporate, but I do think that there probably is a balance to be struck. I mean, the Hanforth meeting that we saw, they are actually the planning councillors for the parish. So what we saw there was just a chaotically ran meeting that was effectively actually quite well run by Jackie Weaver, who's become a bit of a celebrity in her own right. She was there just to enforce the rules, which ironically turned into the whole bloody debate. Excuse my language, but yeah, I think for me probably I like to see, because I quite enjoy architecture, and when you see these buildings going up, especially around Manchester, you think, wow, what a difference that's made to the city, and I think an overwhelmingly positive one. I think more in terms of in urban areas, in the suburbs, then yeah, obviously that has to be done much more sympathetically. To stick a 20, 30 story high rise in the middle of a village would just be absurd. But I think, to simply start saying, well, if you install I don't know, cliche would be a Starbucks on the corner, then, some people would feel that is, really quite offensive to them. And I just think there has to be a balance between preserving things, but progress. We see a lot at the moment with HS2, that's become a very toxic political infrastructure project. There's an argument on both sides, some saying, well, you're just carving up the country. Others say, but if you look back to the Victorian days when you had the railways, then if we had all these debates back then, nothing would have got built. So I think that, you have to look at things and say, well, sometimes these things which now seem to be quite radical, actually 20, 30 years down the line, we'll look back and say, how did we ever cope without it? How did I get by without the Starbucks?
Listen, we'll be right back. We're more reminiscing. See you in a bit.
Feel the vibe.
Talking about that, we're just there. We've got 3 minutes for these. Stay with you there with your Starbucks and your trending.
Am I allowed to say Starbucks on the air, by the way?
You look like you was going in a bit down the nostalgic road there. So I thought, let me get you on there, because it does. Some things do seem that way, but then you look at other things and you're like, all right, we've got the tram in Manchester. But when you go back, but maybe a bit before your time, I've got this grey going on here, so I've got to go back a few years. But we had the trams before. Yeah. And these clever planning people got rid of the trams only to bring them back 40 years later.
I personally think Manchester's probably got the balance about right. I think, as Kyle says, it's great to walk around certain areas in the city centre, like the Green Quarter. A lot of that was just, I think, disused, like timber yards and things like that. Similarly, I think Salford Quays was pretty much disused until they built on it. I think the danger is turning into somewhere like London, where unless you're on 6 figures, you can't afford to live inside 3 or 4 zones. And I think it's something we'll probably come on to on the next part of Becky's segment. But, there are trends.
But when it comes down to it, the most things that people do have an issue with this is the fact that most of the times it is the fact that people who have lived in that area go somewhere else. And usually the area where they sometimes move to is not that much better than where you're moving them from.
And I think, sorry, just very quick, I think as Kyle said, and as Becky said, there is the downside and the upside. And I think inevitably the cost of that progress is that some people will get displaced. I think where it turns a bit toxic is where you have situations in London where that's happening en masse to, over the course of a certain number of years, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And I think that's probably, for me, that would be the danger of gentrification.
Yeah, so it's the mass displacement of local communities.
I think for me, I think what actually happens is probably the more concerning one is just the creep over time of rising housing costs. It's like, for example, my nana, she passed away last year. So she lives in quite a big house, or she did, in Wally Range. That's about to go on the market and probably be snapped up by a property developer. 4-story, 5-bedroom house. The tenants and the people who live on the street, they're probably thinking, well, we can't afford to buy that house that my nana bought, years ago, Windrush generation. And that's what's happening slowly. And no doubt they'll probably turn it into a HMO, have various people living in one big house. And people turn around and say, God, I'm now charging £600 for a 1-bed flat in this house. And that's the knock on, and that's the gentrification that I think concerns most people.
Yeah.
This en masse uprooting of people, that doesn't really happen so often. It's more, you look around and you think, wow, the houses are so expensive now.
I think this is like the generational argument. The boomers who bought their houses for £13,000 in 1979, earning, I don't know, £14,000 in a normal job versus the avocado-loving, cheese-eating millennials who spend all their money.
Okay, we are back, and you are in Choose Research Engine. This is Laura at the Core Show. We've got Liam, we've got Daniel, and we also have special guest to see Becky. And probably as you heard as we came back from the advert, you just got at the end of the discussion where we were speaking on gentrification and the trends in inner city areas. We are going to be moving on to our next topic now, but you can still send in any questions and whatever you have with regard to the previous topic. We're going to be talking about the government proposals, because again, it's still with buildings. We're still talking Becky, real estate. I told you she wasn't just coming from one part of the section on that. So we're looking at the buildings and cladding, and many of you here, we've got loads of towers around here that have got this cladding on it as well. And we know about the tragedy of Grenfell, which still isn't started and still is boiling. And we don't know how that is going to get resolved. But as a result of that, there's been so much that's been learned about cladding on other buildings of different sizes. Some people are going to get some help from the government. Other people are going to have to put in their hand in their own pockets. Where do we start with this, Kyle, Becky?
I think we start with Becky.
This is sort of it's a very difficult, I think it's a very difficult topic, because it's sort of come about as a result of very tragic circumstances. I think we can all remember what happened when we just turned on the news and we saw this massive block of flats in the middle of London up in flames, with people trapped inside and not being able to sort of get out, and all asking ourselves, how is this possibly happening in this country where we have constantly been told that things can happen because of excessive red tape? How are people not protected? And so what's sort of where we are now is that as a result of that, it's kind of a hard one to sort of get into it, that actually I think I'm going to go back to the basics and say where we are, why this is a problem, why this is an issue. For somebody who owns a house, let's say, I'm thinking Somerdale Avenue, for example, where I live, and it's a freehold property, this is only an issue insofar as you hear about it from other people. It has no impact on your life, and it's never going to be something you consider because you own your property on a freehold basis. But there are people out there, I think, probably in the low millions, who actually don't own the freehold property. So what they do is they own a leasehold, which means that they own a property, usually in a flat, and it's not a lease in the way that we understand leases, as in I rent a property for 6 months to a year and then I move out. It's where you go and buy a lease that's 100 years, 110 years, 150 years, or 195 years. That means that you own a portion of that property for that duration of time, and you can sell that lease. So you can leave it for 5 years and then sell it on to somebody else, and then sell it on to somebody else, and share specific statutory rights in relation to that. With those sorts of leases, they tend to come with things like service charge. So if you rent a flat in Manchester on a standard lease for a year or 6 months, if something is wrong with that property, it is the responsibility of the landlord. You have no input in that. If you have a long lease, there is usually service charge provisions, which effectively put the obligation of maintaining the building and the grounds on which the building is located on the tenants. What's happening as a result of Grenfell is that we're in a situation where there is cladding that has been put on these tower blocks or these sort of multi-unit residential properties where the owners own the property on a leasehold basis. And for reasons that have sort of come about as a result of Grenfell, they're not suitable or they pose a fire risk. If you're renting it on a short-term basis, that you don't really have to worry about it because after 6 months, you can pack up and move. If you have a long leasehold for 50, 60 years, you're in a bit of a pickle because what the landlord can do is make all the necessary upgrade to get rid of all the fire risk issues. So cladding is one of them. Install sprinklers if there isn't, and do all the work to make sure that they've got proper functioning fire doors and actually then charge you as the leaseholder, which is an expense that most people weren't sort of expecting or weren't aware of when they bought leasehold properties. And it's very, very difficult. It's become very, very complicated because it means that for some people, they're looking at a bill in the hundreds of thousands of pounds when they thought, oh, I have finally got myself on the property ladder. I own and I've bought my flat and I'm living in it. Maybe thinking that, oh, I'm a young professional, we're a young family, we've bought a flat, we're going to live in it for 2-3 years and we're going to sell it after 3 years' time and move into a house when we've got kids. But they're finding themselves in a position where they can't do that because of this issue that's come about because there's now cladding or fire safety issues that need to be looked at on an urgent basis because there's a threat to life. And doing so requires quite a substantial amount of money to be spent, which the freeholder or the owner of the building can then claim back or claw back from these people who bought these houses, these leasehold properties, these flats on a long-term basis. So where we are and what the government is trying to do is essentially just deal with this because we don't want to be in another situation where a building is going up in flames and everybody's watching and thinking, how did we get here and what should we do? And they're trying to take steps to remediate this. And there's a sort of health and fire, there's a fire bill, fire risk bill or fire safety bill that's currently going through Parliament. It's not set in stones, but there's a lot of proposals flying around at the moment in relation to this. The ones that are sort of caught the press or that have been discussed in the last 2 or 3 weeks is the fact that the government has put aside money, I think it's 1.6 billion, where the government is going to be responsible for remediating cladding. That is an issue. So ACM cladding is going to be replaced on this block of flats, and it's not going to be the responsibility of the residents. The government is going to fund that. And they're going to install sprinkler systems. But the problem with that is it only applies to certain types of building, and they're calling them high-rise buildings. And these high-rise buildings are buildings which are over 18 meters high, so 6 stories and above. But there's a lot of flats and properties out there which don't qualify, which don't meet this criteria of being a high-rise building, so they're 2, 3, or 4 stories high, which will not be covered by this grant or by this scheme, where the government is proposing to say, actually, in that situation, the leaseholders will have to pay for it, but there is a loan, an interest-free loan, a low-interest loan that the government will back and the leaseholders will pay over years. It's not entirely clear if this is going to go ahead or how it's going to go ahead, because the problem is we don't know what works need to be done. We don't know what issues it's going to cover, because the loan may only be low interest in respect of cladding, but there were other issues that need to be considered in terms of fire safety, which is, does the building have sprinklers, for example, and will they need to be installed? Are the fire doors adequate that they have in that building, and will they need to be replaced or put in? And a whole host of other fire safety measures where we're not really getting any clarity on, and where things sort of still up in the air. So it's it's a bit of a mess, if I'm being entirely honest with you, because no one really knows what's going to happen. No one really knows who's going to bear the responsibility of it. But all I can say is that in relation to that, the people who live in high-rise buildings, which is 80 meters and higher or 6 stories and above, are the ones who seem to be sort of getting some level of protection in relation to this. But people who probably live around, walking around Manchester, I see a lot of flats which are not.
Yeah, more than 4 or 6 stories, isn't it?
Yeah, 4 to 6 stories high, where the residents are going to an extent, I think, may well be responsible for removing this cladding, which they didn't they didn't themselves put sort of into the sort of cover the building with, or which when the building was actually put in the building, they were assured by the people who actually knew what they were doing, the professionals, that this was safe and this was appropriate to use for the building. So it's a bit of a difficult situation for residents who own leasehold properties. And up until the fire safety bill is sort of ratified and it's gone through Parliament, and you get a little bit more clarity for residents, I think many people are in this position where they don't know what's going to happen. The value of their properties is essentially either been entirely wiped out, or if you're looking to buy a leasehold property, lenders are actually looking at them with a bit of a jaundiced eye, because they're saying, well, what issues are going to arise in the future in relation to this, and are they a good bet, are they a safe investment essentially, and will the value be wiped out by something like fire safety issues?
Yeah, well, they're saying they're getting a new regulator, isn't it? It's just it does baffle me how these people who were allowed to use this cladding, knowing that it had been deemed defective in other places, get away with what they've got away with. And like you say,
it is actually quite shocking, because I've sort of dipped in and out of the Grenfell inquiry, and it was just the cavalier attitude of the parties involved. I think it's one of those things that they genuinely didn't believe that this would happen and that this was an issue, and they just thought, it was sort of a, how big a risk is this going to be? How big a problem is this going to be? Well, on the balance of probabilities, it's not going to happen, so we'll just stamp it anyway, sort of approach. And then when it did happen, because no one seems to have any answers as to how this has happened and how this is allowed to go through, and why you're in a situation where a building that is supposed to have fire safety doors managed to go up in flames in a single night. I think Grenfell was 63 meters high, which is quite a high building, and the rate at which it bent was absolutely shocking. I've never seen anything like it.
Yeah, but this is the thing that sometimes, and it's not to try and say that to stay in a dismal dungeon type of conspiratorial mindset, but it does make you think that sometimes in all kinds of decision, it does come from a collateral damage perspective, saying, like we were talking on the topic before, it's like, well, like you said yourself, the many and the few, but it's just who judges who the few are sometimes. And it's a shame, because you want to, people like your counsellors and your lawyers, and obviously you pay for what you get in some areas, but you want to trust them. You want to know that they are putting safety things in place for you. And it's a shame that people should have to not have somebody that they can say, yeah, I know you've really got my interest at heart.
But it will be quite interesting to see to what extent gentrification, or sort of harking back to our earlier discussion, actually how that actually played a part in what happened. Because one of the biggest drivers, I think, within London, within those areas, and that was mentioned in the inquiry, was the fact that the council was trying to make this block of flats look, for lack of a better word, pretty. And it's not just there. I mean, I studied in London, and I lived in East London for a very, very long time, Walthamstow and Canning Town. And every time I drive sort of around Canning Town, and I see all this, what I knew as ugly, grey social housing flats, which just seemed to go on very brutalist in construction. And I drive out, and they now have all these fancy colours, yellow and grey, and they've all just been done up, and they've been tarted up to sort of appeal to the new people wanting to invest in the area. So I think there's a sort of another discussion to have around gentrification and the pressure that sort of local authorities do have to make areas more attractive for investors so that they come in with their money and invest. And in doing so, to what extent are they then jeopardizing their local residents and people who actually exist in the area by going for the cheapest way of making something look pretty?
Yeah. Well, again, I suppose you go to some of those areas where, you can't even buy a house, the Kensington areas and whatever. You go in there and you try and build a glass building around them areas, it's not going to happen, is it?
No, it's not. But but it's just definitely not going to happen. But they wanted to,
regardless of whether you think it's pretty, that's period.
But the thing is, with the Grenfell Tower, I think it was local authority owned, and it was a local authority sort of taken. This is one of the reasons why I think it's become such a sort of a political hot button. It's because it was a local authority owned building, and it was a conservative local authority. And I think that there has been, I think much to our collective shame, a little bit of politicking in terms of that, to give the impression that it was the poor people, or in some sort of sectors, it was the immigrants who were just left to die. But that's actually not the point. I think the picture is a little bit more complicated than that, because there are other people who are affected by this cladding issue that actually don't live in local authority sort of buildings, and those ones that I've been talking about who've actually a little bit further out from the inner cities, who've bought leasehold properties because they are cheaper traditionally than freehold properties, and are now potentially being stuck with these bills. So it's a complicated, and I think a little bit more nuanced picture than we've sort of like political discussion sort of allows for, and it saying it's not black and white, but it's complicated. It doesn't really grab headlines more than Conservative Council puts flammable cladding on low-income block of flats, which then burns down, which then burns down. That sort of appeals more to our collective imagination in the worst possible way than it does to say, actually, the council was underfunded, under a lot of pressure, and this cladding was used not just by that particular council, but pretty much everywhere, widely across the country, by a lot of people, private and social landlords, and we are now in a lot of trouble as a result of that. And I think it's going to go on for a very, very long time. And there are people who may not think they're affected by this, who are actually affected by this. And it will come across when it will sort of come to light when they're trying to sell their leasehold properties in inner cities like Manchester, in Burnley, in Wigan, where the buyer says, what is the cladding on this property? And the seller has to go and make inquiries and find out, actually, maybe my property has no value because I have that cladding that's not supposed to be there, or that cladding that's dangerous, or that was fine when it was put in, but isn't okay now, or we don't have adequate fire safety measures which now need to be put in, and you can't then sell your property. So it affects people, it affects private citizens outside of London as much as it does affect people in high-rise local authority buildings.
And Becky, so if you were somebody unfortunate enough to say you live in a 17-meter tall building and you live on the 5th floor or something like that, and you've just bought a leasehold property, or you live in a leasehold property, if you didn't want to take the government loan, if you didn't want your service charge going through the roof, is there any differentiation based on what might be in your lease, or is this like a statutory right now that the freeholder has to increase the service charge to pay for this cladding? Because you can imagine that there would be some leases that have controls on the extent to which the service charge can rise without the agreement of both parties. Is that something that a freeholder could rely on?
Well, it's not. It's freeholders don't have the right to sort of increase service charge, and before any works are carried out, there is a consultation process that a leaseholder, a freeholder needs to go through a Section 20. Don't quote me on that, it's been a while. Section 20 consultation process where they have to say, these are the works that we intend to carry out, and inform and engage the leaseholders in that process. If they go ahead and just do these works, then there's the potential that the leaseholders can say, actually, no, I'm not paying for this because I wasn't properly consulted. But that being said, if the freeholder is in a position where you're potentially, there is a building that is a danger to life, that is a risk, what is the freeholder supposed to do then? Because they have an obligation as a freeholder or as a landlord to maintain the property and to maintain the common areas and make sure that it's maintained in a safe environment. So you can, on the one hand, say as a freeholder, I want to live in a safe building, and your lease says that's fine, you're entitled to that, but you have to pay for the maintenance of that building. Then say, well, actually, I don't want to pay for the maintenance.
So I mean, if as the landlord has the obligation to make sure that the block of flats are safe, it is in the tenant's interest to live in a safe block of flats. But if that tenant isn't eligible for that automatic government support, the landlord does a consultation, and there's 10 tenants in the block of flats, and 9 tenants say, okay, we'll pay for that through our service charge. If the 10th tenant says, I'd love to live in a safe block of flats, but I simply can't afford the increase on my service charge, presumably the landlord go ahead with the recladding and just not charge that 10th tenant because the landlord has no contractual right to, presumably.
Well, speaking just generally on a service charge issue, you can't just object to something that needs to be done because you don't want to and say you're not going to pay for it because you're going to get the benefit of it. So you as a tenant will have an obligation in your lease that says you will contribute to the service charge, and you'll be contributing and you will be charged for the service charge on an annual basis, and sometimes the reserve funds depending on the service charge provisions. But in relation to this one, in relation to the fire safety issue specifically, it is a complicated one because on the one hand, tenant groups are saying this is absolutely unfair. Tenants should not be under an obligation to be doing this. Tenants should not be under an obligation to be remediating this because ultimately they only have a sort of a finite interest in the property. I don't know, 100 years. After 100 years, unless they sort of go through such a renewal process, their interest ceases, and these works will be the benefit of the freeholder for a very long time to come. And the freeholder is saying, well, I don't live in the property, I'm not at risk, and I'm on an obligation to make sure the property is safe. What do we do? So there's a bit of a stalemate in that regard in terms of who's actually ultimately responsible for this. And I think this is what needs to be covered. This is where the government will need to come in and take some proactive action, because I don't think, in my view anyway, the landlord and tenant parties are to blame in this. They acted in good faith. We have regulations in relation to health and safety which have been put in place by central government. We have regulators, we have inspectors who are supposed to monitor this. They have failed to make sure that the materials that are being used for residential properties are safe materials, either because they've voted on the regulations or they haven't adhered to them properly, or wherever's gone wrong, it hasn't been on, it can't be on the back, in my view, of, perhaps controversially, of leaseholders or freeholders. I think the failing here has been at a regulatory level, and I think that the government needs to be held accountable in relation to this. I don't think it's fair, because landlords and freeholders can only do, and builders and developers can only comply with the standards as they are set. If the government doesn't set adequate standards, it should be on the government to make sure that if there's any fallout in that, they are responsible, if only to stop them doing this again.
I completely agree. So I'm full disclosure. I live in a 6-story block of flats. I'm not sure how tall it is, but I'm pretty sure it's just below 18 meters. But I'm lucky enough to live in an ugly, uncladded block of flats. So this isn't a direct concern to me, but I know that I would be pretty furious if, because of the government's failure to properly regulate how buildings should be cladded, I was lumped with, I don't know how much it would cost, but it's certainly going to go into the hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands. And I think
it's not very clear, is it? Because it says here, what this for lower and medium raised blocks of flats between 4 and 6 stories. The government is introducing a long-term low-interest loan scheme and has promised that no leaseholder will ever pay more than £50 a month towards the removal of unsafe cladding, and many will pay far less than that.
But how do they know that, though? How do they know how much it's going to cost? There's over 274,000 flats that are potentially affected by this. So how do they know how much it's going to cost? Are they going to go to these removal people and say, actually, this is how much it capped at removing this? There's very little detail in this that will give anybody any sort of comfort. And it's a proposal. It's not set in stone. It's not in the bill. It's just. It's sound by policy. It can be changed at any time. I think it will be telling what happens when the sort of the fire safety bill goes through, and actually what measures are in place in the budget for next year, because there's also discussions about introducing a tax for any new developments coming up to cover this issue, which will raise $2 billion over 10 years. But will this happen? Will it not happen? Is it something that's just been thrown out there into the news cycle to sort of pacify people? We don't know, because it's.
And I think even on the government's numbers, £50 a month, that's £600 a year. That's a lot of money for something that wasn't your fault. It's not something that I'd want to hand to my landlord because the government got their building regulations wrong. So I do think it's probably something that needs a bit more attention.
And we're going to be right back. And yes, 674. I haven't mentioned it yet. We are also tonight on YouTube and Facebook. You can go on Facebook at Legacy 90.1, YouTube at SEUK Global. We'll be right back.
Feel the vibe on Legacy. If you have an
it is a heartless one in so many ways. From where it started, in the sense of acknowledging the issue with those in the first place, to where it just seems like you're just constantly rubbing salt in the wounds.
I think part of the problem, I didn't want to interject, but I think what the actual issue is that the regulations are there and they are pretty robust. I think the problem is that the manufacturer was changing the description of the items. So it's insulation, and in between the insulation is this aluminium sheeting. And it was this that wasn't up to regulation standard. And what they're saying is they're all passing the buck. So the manufacturer of one insulation saying, well, the supplier of this material, they fell short. So I think that, and that's, I think, a bit of a misconception that comes through. It's not regulation, I don't think, is the issue. It's the lack of accountability on the manufacturer's position.
The buck stops with the regulator. If the rate, that's the whole point of the regulator, is to look at something and see if it's up to par. If you
but the point was it wasn't at regulation standards, and that's the issue. It's the product was defective.
How was that up by the regulators?
Sorry?
Why were the regulators not checking this properly? How did they not pick this up?
Yeah, well, that's possibly an issue, but the actual regulations themselves apparently are adequate. So when they test other insulation products to that standard, they're fine. It's that the manufacturers were getting through loopholes saying, well, it came in here and this and that. There are definitely issues that need to be addressed. But I think
I would have thought that there's either an issue if the manufacturers are flouting the regulations, then certainly from a litigation perspective, every time you try and sell your leasehold and you take a £30,000 hit, then that's a loss of chance claim and you can sue the manufacturer. Or
sorry about that. Welcome back. You're answering to Search Engine with Anthony, and this is the Law at the Core show with our co-hosts today, Daniel and Kyle, and our special guests, Becky, and we're going to get it right, Zwane.
Close.
No, Zwane.
Yes, that's it.
Zwane. See? Okay, I'll definitely have it by the end. And yeah, we've been having conversation. We've been talking about cladding. We've been talking about gentrification in different forms, not just in the one from a negative perspective. We have stayed on that topic because it was, wanted a few more perspectives and answers. But we've got a few areas that we were going to look at, Daniel. So, Kyle, and because we can just jump around like that because we have that kind of knowledge with us. So where do we want to go?
So I think we can briefly consider the likely long-term impacts of COVID on the real estate market. It's probably something that actually ties in quite nicely with the first topic on gentrification. And yeah, I guess, I don't know, initial observations. I think what we said about the brain drain from Manchester to London, and it's something I'd be interested to get Becky's thoughts on, but it does seem that the pandemic is, if not reversing, then at least slowing that trend. And when we say brain drain, essentially people who grew up in the north, who were born in the north, who are educated up to certainly sixth form level in the north, going to university and ending up going into high-paying jobs in London, because obviously the salaries in London pay a lot more. There are more of those high-paying jobs, and effectively paying all their local taxes in London, contributing to the London economy, which obviously is not good for the north. And as I say, I'd be interested to get Becky's thoughts on this, but it does seem that that trend, if not being reversed, is something that's being slowed by the pandemic. I think I read in the papers that for the first time in, I can't remember, I'm always bad with for the first time in X amount of years. I always get it wrong by about 50 years. But I think it was pretty substantial. I think it might have been the first time since, I don't know, maybe the 50s or something. London's population actually shrank over a 12-month period. So I think London's population's actually shrank by, again, I might be making this up, but I think it's up to nearly 1 million. London's population has shrank since the start of the pandemic, which is a huge reduction considering I think it's a population of maybe 7 or 8 million. And I've seen that on an anecdotal level. I know quite a few people who have relocated back up north who used to work in London, albeit temporarily for the pandemic. And that goes to the cost of housing. I mean, if coronavirus is creating a situation now where with the assistance of technology, you can potentially live in Manchester or Leeds and still, work in London. And because of coronavirus and the shift to home working, even when restrictions are eased, you'll probably only be in the office for a day or two a week. Then it begs the question, why would you want to live in London and have to pay London prices, have to pay London rents, London mortgages, have the stress of the tube every day? Would you not much rather live in Manchester, work from home for a part of the week, jump on the train that's now 2 hours when you have to be in London? And yeah, it's just considering whether that's going to be a wider trend. And I suppose most poignantly for our purposes, is that going to increase house prices in Manchester when you suddenly get a load of rich people from London relocating to Manchester?
Oh, those pesky Southerners coming up north to gentrify Burnley and Grimsby.
Not that I'd like to see.
I think that was one of the concerns with the BBC's relocation, wasn't it? They were saying that Salford is going to become like the new areas of London, but I don't think it's quite happened yet, has it?
Well, but they have changed certain roads and names and parts of what was
Queen Elizabeth Road now.
Salford Quays. They've extended Salford Quays. Areas that weren't Salford Quays before are now Salford Quays. Automatically is putting some of the houses in that area very much around, because where United is, that wasn't Salford Quays. It is now classed as Salford Quays, where the football ground is, all around that area, where the new Tesco and Lidl is. Yeah, I know it's not Waitrose, guys.
I think there was a Waitrose actually on Salford Quays, and they left.
So, you know.
So just very quickly, I've just had a chance to check my numbers, and predictably, I was quite far out. So the population shrank 300,000 over 12 months, with a further 400,000 saying they plan to move in the next 12 months. And it's the sharpest reduction for 30 years, which is still pretty significant. And
how far? Well, I probably just don't know, because probably to Southerners are saying north is past Watford. How far are we saying? Well, I think a lot of them would. I think Manchester, I'm maybe being a bit biased, I think Manchester's the second city, so I think a lot of them would come to Manchester.
I grew up in the Midlands. Birmingham is definitely the second city.
Boo.
It is the Midlands, the heart of the country. No, but it is quite interesting to see what's going to happen. I think I do agree with you, Carl, that I think there's going to be a bit of a reversal of the flight from the regions to like sort of the inner city areas, where people are going to think, well, actually, do I need to live in a small, pokey little flat and pay an extortionate amount of rent for the privilege when I'm working from home 3 out of 5 days, and I can move a little bit further out and have like a nice garden and actually have space? Because for me, I've got quite a friends again who live in London and who are sort of who are studying law, who studied law, who are practicing barristers. And prior to the lockdown, they were very much, one of my friends would have considered moving out of like the N1 sort of postcode, because that's where she grew up. And she was Islington, like the furthest she would go out of London was like Tottenham. And even then that was, oh my God. And now she's actively looking for a house with a partner, because they're getting married. And they're looking at places like Stevenage and Luton. Because they can get more for their money, they can get a lot more space, and they can have an office, and it's not like a pokey 1 or 2 bedroom flat where they're just going to have to be both in. So I do think you probably will get professionals moving out of the inner city areas and a little bit further out. I certainly, for one, will not be looking for a flat or a house in close proximity of Manchester City Centre, for example, because I live in Bolton. I live in my sister's house in Bolton, and I can work from home most of the time, and then just drive half an hour into Manchester for 2 or 3 days when I need to, and have space and room to stretch my legs, a nice garden to sit in during the summer, and not be sort of in a flat, which can be quite difficult, I think, particularly over lockdown, because when we couldn't go out over the summer last year, I could go in the back garden and take my kit and sit outside in the sun and put my sun hat on and do my Zoom meetings from the comfort of the back garden. But some of my colleagues were stuck in flats. They couldn't do that, and they could only go out for an hour, and you're cooped in that environment. So I think that a lot of people will be looking to sort of move out. And there's also the impact of how COVID is impacting businesses. Again, firms are now looking as to, we are paying X amount for rental property in St. Paul's or in Liverpool Street or in the financial centres and in Manchester City Centre. Do we really need to be paying that much rent when people aren't going to be coming to the office often? And we've got technology that has actually shown that people can work remotely effectively. Can we justify as well, with places like London, I think, can businesses justify paying people the London rating again when they don't have to be in the office anymore? They don't have to commute in the office. So I think probably it may have a depressive effect from some wages in certain sectors. I think businesses may start looking as well a little bit further out than the traditional sort of business and city centre areas in terms of building or having their premises. And I think the death of the high street, I know it's been spoken about quite a lot, but Debenhams is gone. Topshop is going. Everything seems to be moving online. So,
and nobody's looking to get into those buildings, aren't there? So the next thing you're going to see them, just like the mills, turning into flats.
Well, that or Starbucks.
Starbucks will be in the flats.
I feel like Starbucks is getting a lot of free promo.
Costa coffee.
But then you've got the other thing that I was reading somewhere with regard to real estate and property development, and there's a lot of small companies that are losing out on that. But even with the bigger companies, there's a lot of consolidation that are coming together. So you're getting a greater amount of properties being held by small amounts of companies, and this apparently is something that's much more further ahead when you're looking at the likes of China, like that, in the sense of 3 or 4, 5, 6 companies are virtually come together to try and fight COVID together.
Well, there's an interesting thing that is quite a well-known supermarket chain, and what they're often charged with is what they call land banking. So what they will do is they will just buy up, acres and acres of land across the country, effectively hold on to that land, wait till the prices change in their favour, and then they'll pop up a load of their supermarkets. Or worse still, they'll basically strangle out other competition because they've got all the prime sites. It happens especially during recessions when prices are typically lower. Those with deep pockets will then swoop in, get some real bargains, and when the economy picks back up, flood the market with it, and make a very tidy profit there. There's loads of strategies that I think the key is if you've got the resources, generally you do well, and those that don't, unfortunately, tend to lose out most.
Yeah. It is going to be quite interesting because I was talking to this about my sister, and I did raise the question at work because I was thinking to myself, while working remotely, can I just pack up my things and just go and work from South Africa and only go into the office when it's necessary and be in a land of perpetual sun? And the answer was no, the tax will not allow that.
See the Barbados one? Barbadian government's allowing visa-free travel for 12 months to come and stay out there because of COVID and working remotely. I mean, that's just a dream, isn't it?
I could be doing this from Barbados.
The other thing, just probably going a bit off the topic in stuff, is because we're, in a sense, the UK, we're behind in so many areas, aren't we? And as much as we're, in a lot of sense, the governments, even where it's UK and America, are going at China. China actually seems to be the marker that in another way they're following, especially from a technological and a business perspective, and from also a technological surveillance also perspective. Just with regards to this market, again, let me just read this part again. It says China, wherein the top 50 players control 45% of China's real estate market. The top 10 have close to 25% of the market share, and after COVID-19, this shows the potential of consolidation when it starts playing out. For China, consolidation started in 2008, and for the UK, it started in 2017.
Yeah, that's happening across the UK, where you've got overseas companies investing in, and this is really off topic now, but in some quite sensitive infrastructure projects like nuclear. But I guess a bit closer to home at the moment, and I suppose for the benefit for the community, you've got the Far East Company, Far East Consortium, and they are basically Chinese investors that are developing a lot of properties around the Harper area. But thankfully, hopefully, it looks like they're turning it into social housing. So the plans are to demolish a lot of probably post-war low-rise buildings and tenanted properties, and actually convert them into more modern day with parks and all sorts of facilities. That, I guess, is being used for the common good. whereas some would say there can be nefarious objectives for some of them. Who knows? But yeah, slightly a bit more off topic there.
Yeah, it's all right.
It's probably a nice. See, I was about to say it's actually quite a nice segue into just the final real estate topic, which is government schemes relating to support for tenants and homeowners. I think we all have heard about the mortgage freezes, the rent holidays, or maybe that's the wrong way around, the mortgage holidays and the rent freezes, the stamp duty suspension. So yeah, I don't know if Becky, you want to just say a few words on that.
Yeah, I won't really sort of go into much detail about that, primarily because we're sort of coming to the end of the financial year, and we're sort of seeing, touch wood, the end of COVID. So some of these schemes will be coming to an end soon. But as sort of Dan's mentioned, there are sort of mortgage freezes at the moment for homeowners who are sort of struggling to make mortgage payments themselves because they've lost their jobs. Sort of a bit of a cautionary tale or caution in relation to that is that that doesn't mean that your mortgage is going to be frozen and that the money that you haven't been paid won't become due. It will become due. It just means that it's deferred. So you are still paying interest on that for homeowners. And there's been a sort of some articles that have sort of gone around in the last few days that I've seen where there was a freeze in terms of sort of evictions over COVID. For people who couldn't pay any rent, but apparently landlords are finding loopholes to evict tenants. So even though we are in lockdown, some tenants are still being evicted. But from a landlord perspective, it is still quite difficult because the courts are absolutely just struggling at the moment. They've got so many cases, they're dealing with a massive backlog. So even if there are proceedings issues to vacate premises, it's taking a while for it to work through the court system. So landlords as well are in a bit of a bother in relation to that. Generally, in terms of schemes, sort of encourage and help people on the property ladder, there is quite a few out there. So one that sort of always comes to mind and that most people be aware of is the sort of the Help to Buy scheme, with the Help to Buy ISA that came to an end. But there's still quite a few other schemes, like for example, shared ownership schemes that encourage low income earners to actually get on the property ladder. There's also rent to buy schemes around. They're not as widely available or as popular as sort of shared ownership or help to buy schemes out there, but they're becoming a little bit more prevalent within the market. And essentially what they do is they allow a person to rent the property, I don't know, at 8% of the market rent for a period of 5 years, so that they can save up that additional 20%, that they'll be paying, with the option of buying that property after a year, either buying it outright or buying it in shares and then doing a part rent or part own part rent basis. So I'm pretty sure that Rishi Sunak will probably be introducing more schemes in the next budget to try and encourage people to actually invest to buy houses, because developers have been building. But obviously, having been in lockdown and potentially looking into recession, people may not have the money to do so. So the government may introduce some more schemes to sort of try and massage the property market into a sort of a more stable position and not sort of let it nosedive into a decline.
I think the big as well is,
go on, Kat.
Just to say, I think the SDLT stamp duty, that up to £15,000 saving, that's due to end is it 31st of March, which has been a big incentive actually to help people move, and that was introduced to hopefully to try and encourage people to keep going and selling properties and buying houses during the pandemic. Really, I think to try and stop what happened in 2008. Although now there's arguments to say it was actually a little bit premature to introduce that measure. We may see that extended, I think, beyond 31st of March. But I think certainly for those buying properties at the lower level, that's quite a significant saving potentially.
Well, again, the money that was given out is going to have to be paid back, isn't it? And this is where the impact on some smaller companies where it can be an issue where they could go under.
Yeah. What they're talking about effectively is this will become our generation's war debt. So effectively, this is something that will just continue to be repaid for generations to come, which is quite staggering given the fact it's only really just under actually 12 months. The level of debt that we've incurred in that period, unprecedented, really. I suppose the measures that the government's introduced. Obviously, we had the help out to eat out to help out scheme during the summer. That probably cost the government however many millions for those meals. Clearly had no real impact. If anything, probably increased some issues further down the line. But yeah, Rishi clearly announced a lot of measures there. So
I think they found the magic money tree. Well, he has been on a spending spree after 10 years of austerity. But yeah, it'll be interesting to see what the budget holds, I think.
Yeah. And I suppose on the top of that, and it kind of like leads into another area I know we're not going to stay on, is how then these companies that have found themselves in these positions are going to be dealt with. You know, whether if they are big enough or medium sized, whether they're going to be allowed to look and say, all right, then if we close down this part of the company and put that over there and restructure it here, or is it just that no, you know, the courts are going to come in and say, no, we need to just see how we can make your money. Isn't that, I mean, again, this might be for you again, Becky, in the sense of there's something around, is it when a company they don't have money, but they have assets that cover the money?
I'm going to defer to Kyle on this because I think this is probably more in his ballpark than mine.
Is it Kyle?
I think this is more Kyle for me.
Yeah, so there are a couple of measures that's recently been introduced that are actually helping businesses who are going through financial difficulties. I think the biggest one, which is having the most impact, is a prohibition on winding up petitions. So the idea there is that, and this is a temporary measure brought in, I think it's due to end 31st of March again, is that if you are a creditor of a company, traditionally what you would do is you could serve a statutory demand on the company, and if it failed to repay the debt after 21 days, that was proof that the company was prima facie insolvent. In which case, if they owed more than £750, you could bring a winding up petition against it. So that's quite, it's actually quite a low threshold, actually, £750. And that can wreak untold havoc on a company if you do bring a winding up petition against it. So what the government's done is they've introduced a measure whereby if the debtor company can show that they've been affected by COVID, then a creditor isn't actually able to bring winding up proceedings at the moment. And it sounds quite simple, but it's actually been very effective in stopping creditors from enforcing debts. The problem, though, is what will actually seems to be is that we just now have quite a high number of what we call like zombie companies that effectively took various government grants and loans for COVID support. And then obviously they've got protection against creditor action. So what that's really meant is that for the last probably 12 months, you've got a lot of companies out there that are just continuing to trade, much to the frustration of creditors, without any real repercussions at the moment. Now, I say at the moment, once the moratorium ends, although chances are that will actually be extended again, there could be just an influx of insolvency cases being brought. Now, more personally for some directors, and most of the measures introduced by the government have largely been to protect businesses. Another one is a relaxation on wrongful trading. So what that is that if a director is continuing to trade a business which he or she knows is insolvent, ordinarily that person could be held personally liable for the debts of the company. Again, what the government have done is introduced a relaxation on that rule just for COVID, during COVID, to say that basically no action will be brought against the director during this period for wrongful trading. Now,
So somebody could be claiming furlong, getting scheme money from the government, but actually the company's not really doing that well and really should be insolvent.
Yeah, so the test for insolvency is quite simple. So there are two. The first one is a balance sheet insolvent. This is where your assets are lower than your liabilities. So if you own a property that's worth 100,000, but your debts are 150,000, strictly speaking, you are balance sheet insolvent as a company. That's not really a test that's used very often because that can change at any moment. The main test is what they call the cash flow test, which is where your outgoings are higher than your incomings. And that's usually proven by a statutory demand, which will say, right, I'm presenting you on 1st of January with statutory demand to say, right, you owe me £20,000. You've now got 21 days to pay up. If you don't, then I can say to the courts, well, they haven't been able to discharge the debt or secure it. So on that basis, then that is grounds that the company is cash flow insolvent, and that's enough for you to say, right, this company needs to be wound up. So very easy actually to show whether a company is solvent or otherwise. But what's important for, if any listeners are business owners, is that you really have got to have a strong handle on your accounts procedures. Time and again, we bring actions against directors, or we defend actions made by directors where they've basically just traded, buried their head in the sand, probably knowing that they are insolvent, continue to incur debt, which they think they're doing to try and rescue the company. But ultimately, they do run the risk that if the company goes under, they could be held personally liable. Now, often people think, well, I'm trading under a limited company, and that will effectively protect me. That only works if usually an insolvency practitioner, if they come in and say, well, when you thought you were going into insolvency, you took steps to protect creditors. Because what happens is, as a company director, ordinarily your obligations are usually to the shareholders of the company. But once you reach an insolvency process or where you think you are insolvent, actually legislation stipulates that your obligations then shift to to creditors, and you have to do all you can to try and preserve any assets of the company. So the things that we look at when we go and investigate companies are transactions defrauding creditors, transactions at an undervalue, which is where you sold an asset of the company during a period of insolvency, and it can stretch back up to 6 years. And basically what that is saying that, say you owned a property for 100,000 and you sold it for 50,000, an insolvency practitioner can come in and actually apply to court to have that transaction unwound. Or instead of that, they can ask the directors to be personally liable for the 50,000 difference. Then we've got what's called preferences. So if, again, in the run-up to insolvency situation, you've got 6 creditors, one may be HMRC, another could be a bank with a loan, and 4 others happen to be friends or family. If in the run-up to insolvency you think, right, we've got a pot of X amount in the bank, my overall creditor position, my debtor position is about 100,000, and I owe my friends and family 60,000. If you pay them off first, then that is held to be a preference. So you've paid off some creditors to the detriment of others. So these are other things that we look at when we're investigating director actions.
Just a quick question, Kyle. I just want to ask a question about. Sorry, I just want to ask a question about something you touched upon.
Go ahead.
Where you say that if a director sells a property at an undervalue, it can be reversed, so an application can be made. What happens to the buyer in that situation?
It depends on what the relationship is with the buyer. Now, if you are deemed to be unconnected, then that's a transaction which is reviewable up to 6 months, but it's rarely do you actually overturn the transaction. Usually what happens is you make the director accountable for it. So if you as a buyer go in with good faith and purchase the property, then the law will usually protect you. What happens is the focus is turned on the director, basically, and we often see directors will say to us, we never knew that this was a problem, but because they weren't having proper accountants' advice, they didn't realize they were trading whilst they were insolvent. And these are transactions which go back sometimes many years ago, but we're saying, but unfortunately, we have to look into this. An application's made to court, and often they are held to be liable for it. But as a buyer, generally, they are protected. But yeah,
scary.
Sorry. Yeah, insolvency tends to be a bit scary, especially if you're on the receiving end of the letters.
And I suppose that on the back of it, then it's like, is it virtually the same as, or links in with bankruptcy? So does it mean that there's certain things you won't be able to do anymore?
Yeah, so bankruptcy is just the insolvency term for individuals. Okay. So to be made bankrupt, either you can do it yourself, where you apply to court to say, I just simply cannot repay my creditors. Or again, a creditor can bring an action if you owe at least £5,000. So if you owe over £5,000, again, a creditor can issue a statutory demand against you. Now, this is only for unsecured debts. So if, for example, you've got a mortgage, which, over your house, that's secured, what would happen there is the lender would just enforce the security and apply to court for possession and sale of that asset. So bankruptcy is only relevant for unsecured creditors. So those that you haven't given any form of security to, that could be things like utility providers, mobile phone contracts, car finance, any unsecured loans that you give.
Sorry, you was on unsecured.
Okay.
Welcome back, people. We are still here. We're still talking. I didn't cut you off in the middle of sentence. We haven't gone on to another topic. Carl was just cleaning up for us,
Yeah, bankruptcy. People often think it's just a case of wiping the slate clean, but often it's not as straightforward as that. It's usually that for 12 months, and usually the official receiver will be appointed trustee over your estate. Their duty is to investigate any assets you may have. People often think wrongly that bankruptcy just means you walk away scot-free. It doesn't. It's just that probably more often than not, people who are bankrupt genuinely don't have any assets. But there are unscrupulous people that will try and declare themselves bankrupt, only to then be investigated by an official receiver, who will then try and trace assets. And it's quite incredible the powers they have to trace your assets. And so, yeah, for that period of 12 months, you're under their supervision. Whilst you're bankrupt, you can't act as a director of a company. And at the same time, the Secretary of State can apply for you to be disqualified as a director. So usually, most cases with bankruptcy don't really tend to see the light of day of a solicitor. It's usually just the more complex ones, but yeah, we've had some pretty sad cases actually, where you've got high-flying bankers that end up with mental health problems, incur lots of debt, alcohol addiction and things, and their life's just completely turned upside down. Very, very sad bankruptcy more often than not. I try not to do so many of those cases. But it's tough, and I think people just need to be aware, obviously, of financial commitments, really.
I know we've kind of moved off that topic, but I've got a couple of questions. I don't think you're going to have time or whatever to answer anything really. This one was from Mr. Williams. It says, I moved back north, so it must have been a southerner. Moved back north. I'm a property finder and commercial residential loans investment with up to 5,000 up to 5 million. I even approached Legacy radio station to see if I could help. I'm sure you can. I'm sure you can. 500 to 5 million. I'm sure you can. And then I got also another one, and I don't know. This is an example. It just says, say you own a land with forest, and a company say HS2 get the right to use the land as long as they return it in the same condition. Can they be made to account for the damage? Well, they're not going to return it if they built HS2 on it, are they? Do they? Because don't they take the land? Don't they compulsory purchase it?
Yeah, that's so that's that. This one is it depends on what the position is, and if they're saying that they have a right to use the land, then they're not buying it. They would have served on the landowner a notice to treat and a notice of entry,
okay,
which effectively means that for all intents and purposes that land is transferred to the relevant sort of body to use for whatever project that they're going through. And at the end of the project, they then have to hand the land back to the landowner.
That could be what, 100 years, 1,000 years?
No, the one that I can actually think of that comes to mind is I had a transaction last year where one of my clients was actually buying land, and as we did a local authority search, it turned out there was a notice to treat and a notice of entry that had been served in respect of that piece of land. And what that essentially meant was that it was in Canning Town, and when they were building whatever they were building in Canning Town, something to do with trains and rails, and it's not really my area of expertise, the land network rail had occupied a bit of that land, not the entirety of it, but a little bit to put up portaloos and a construction site and something along those lines. So they were using it. There was some paving as well that as a result of their use had been damaged, some curbing, some greenery as well. So when they left, network rail obviously didn't put it in the exact same condition as it was when they moved in, but they just fixed it, for lack of a better word. But because the local authority is usually involved in this situation, didn't consider the land to have been remediated. So when it came to buying the property, from a legal perspective, the land was still technically, because it hadn't been remediated and because the local authority hadn't consented to the withdrawal of the notice of entry and the notice of treat, the land was still technically in the hands of network rail. And as far as network rail, as far as the local authority was concerned, there were some outstanding remediation works that needed to be carried out by network rail before the land was returned to the landowner. So this is something that we've sort of been working where there's compulsory purchase issues. I would say, first of all, always get involved, always get your lawyer on hand to make sure that your interests are protected. But this tends to work hand in hand with local authorities. And you will find that the local authorities actually do have expectations of the relevant body or company or whomever it is who's taken occupation of the land in terms of remediating it and putting it back into the state that it was in. And if you're saying that it's land with forest as well, it will be quite interesting to find out if it's forest, what kind of forest it is, because we do have some protected forests in this country. And what kind of trees have they been cut down and what that position is in relation to that. And so it will be something that will be worth sort of discussing either with a solicitor and also with the involvement of your local authority, because you may find that there's measures in place to protect the landowner that the landowner may actually not be aware of, and that the local authority may actually be on the ball about this already, or that they just need a little gentle nudge to prompt the company exercising the CPO to take action and remediate whatever negative impact they've had.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, there you go, Jay. I think that was a very concise answer. Yeah, wow. It's right though, isn't it? It's right. You leave it as you found it.
Sometimes it's not always possible. If you cut down a tree and you shred it, living it as you found it may be a bit of a difficult necessarily regret. But there are measures to protect landowners, and sometimes, and I know it may not seem like it, but sometimes local authorities are your friends. And you may find that they may sort of be able to prompt the landowner to act in a way that is sort of responsible to prompt the developer or whomever is doing the work, so the statutory undertaker, to act in a way that is a little bit more responsible and mindful of the landowner's rights as all over their own land, because you do own it after all.
Okay, you got a big thank you there from Jay for that advice there. And that was free, Jay. Solicitors don't really give their time and advice for free. So
well, I didn't say it was free.
Listen, guys, time has absolutely flowed. We've literally out of time, man. And there were some other areas that we wanted to top on. So, but just before we go, just that last area there, if you just want to give a little bit about that, Daniel, the Hogan Lavelle.
Yeah, sure. So essentially, the way solicitors, the way a solicitor is measured in terms of how hard they're working, how much money they're bringing in, is through something called billable hours. So essentially, you've got a little timer on your computer, and you have to click go every time you start on a piece of work, every time you take a call, even when you're in a meeting. And that way the firm can see how much time you've spent on a piece of work and how much money that time is bringing in. Now, solicitors have targets that they have to meet, or should be meeting, in terms of how much billable hours, how much money they bring into the firm. And what Hogan Lovells have done, Hogan Lovells are a big firm in London. They have now implemented a system whereby time spent by solicitors on initiatives to promote equality, diversity, and inclusion are now counted as billable time that counts towards the relevant solicitors' annual targets. So solicitors have always been encouraged, or certainly more recently have been encouraged, to get involved with equality, diversity initiatives. But that would generally be something you'd have to do on top of your target. So you'd have to hit your target, and then you should also be spending time doing stuff that promotes equality. What Hogan Lovells have done is they've rolled that into one and said, if you spend 2 hours going to a socially disadvantaged community and talking to some kids in a school, that counts towards your annual target. So it's a great initiative, and it's hopefully something we'll see more of in the profession.
How many firms are you aware that have said, okay, we want to follow that lead? That you're aware of?
Me personally, none, but I don't know if Kyle knows of any others.
No, they tend to say, well, they encourage people to go and do all of these great initiatives, and so, for example, you may get 2 or 3 days a year, which is called CSR, corporate social responsibility days, but that effectively doesn't count towards billing targets, which is just this keeps you on the treadmill, I suppose. Ever billing, much to the bane, I'm sure, of clients. But yeah, if you could introduce some form of recognition of that work, and it's genuinely recognised, that I'm sure would have a huge beneficial impact on diversity in the profession.
Hogan
it can only be a good
American firm, yeah.
I'm not sure, actually. I don't think they're American. I think they started out in Birmingham, actually. Don't quote me on that.
Where are they from, Daniel?
So they've certainly got a big office down in London.
Okay.
Couldn't tell you whether they originated in America or not, but yeah, it's a very big firm, a very well-established firm.
All right.
But usually where one big firm starts, others follow.
Well, maybe we could get somebody from there to come in and have a chat about, why they're setting standards that people don't want to follow.
No, I think they will follow.
Okay. Listen, guys, we've gone over. Thank you again very much. And Becky, let me put you right there at the top and say thank you very much for. Oh gosh, what's happening?
Now you've.
Gosh, it's God.
The irony.
Thank you very much for joining us and sharing information and knowledge. And wow, I'm going to have to watch it again to really download much more of what you said, because I know you. I seen you get in the zone one time, and it was great. So thank you, and hopefully we can do something again. I mean, the guys are very good at being fair and making sure we do get some women on the show. So hope they keep up.
I think it's been more women, hasn't it, Anthony?
Yeah, I think there has actually, to be honest. Yeah, I'm not going to take that away from you, Carl, at all. All right then, guys. So I don't know. It'll be next month, wouldn't it? Yes. We'll be coming with the date.
Yeah, we'll.
With a date.
Yeah. I know you're busy, guys, but we'll get them back, people. So yes, thank you very much. It's been the Law at the Core. We've been talking to Becky Zwane.
Yes.
Kyle Blackburn, I could get that. And I'm not even going to try Daniel. Daniel. Oh, go on, say it. Adagimo. See?
Yeah, close enough.
Hey, thank you very much. And all the best to Liam when you see him, yeah?
Of course.
Okay. I don't know
Thanks,
if you have
Anthony.
any last words that you want to say, any of you?
Thank you for having me.
Been a pleasure.
Keep on top of your accounts.
Yeah. And stay safe in COVID, yeah, I suppose. All right. Here we go, guys. Thank you. Okay, that's it from us here. Legacy Radio 90.1. It's been a search engine. It's been Law at the Court show. Next week, it should be, is Tap Talks meet search engine. And, topic, I'm not sure at the moment, but I'm sure, as you know, where Tap are concerned, it will be something of interest and of a need to know. All right, take care. See ya. And goodbye.